He thought he was the only soul left on that mountain. For months, not a single sound had broken the silence. Not a wagon creaking down the trail, not a wolf calling out from the ridge. Just the slow crunch of his boots through frozen earth, the soft hiss of wind against the cabin walls, and the hollow rhythm of a man who'd learned to live with ghosts. Elias Maddox had once been a man of laughter and light, husband to a woman who smelled of pine and honey, father to a little girl with eyes that outshone the morning. But that was before the fever took them, before the nights grew long and the world forgot he existed. Now the mountain was his only company. He woke with the sun, chopped wood till his hands went raw, hunted deer when the snow allowed, and spoke to no one. Sometimes he'd catch himself whispering to the empty chair across from the fire. Sometimes he'd stop mid-task, thinking he'd heard his daughter's giggle echo through the wind, only to remember there was no one left to laugh. That morning began like all the others, gray, cold, and wordless. The sky hung heavy with clouds, the kind that promised another storm. Elias stepped outside, hat pulled low, axe over his shoulder, breath curling in the air. The stillness was thick enough to choke on. Even the crows had gone quiet. He was halfway through splitting the first log when it happened. A sound. Soft at first. Faint. So faint he almost thought he'd imagined it. He paused, the axe frozen midair, listening. There it was again, thin and broken, like a whisper caught in the wind. He frowned, tilting his head. Wind's playing tricks again, he muttered. But then it came again. Clearer this time, a cry, not the cry of an animal, not the moan of a tree bowing under snow. No, this was different. It was small, weak, human, a baby's cry. The sound crawled through the trees, soft but desperate. It sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He dropped the axe, the thud swallowed by snow. His breath quickened as he turned toward the noise, scanning the white wilderness that stretched endlessly beyond his barn. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing faintly. No answer. Only another cry, this time sharper, closer. Elias's heartbeat picked up. He grabbed his coat tighter and trudged forward, boots sinking deep into the snow. The wind clawed at his face, biting through the wool scarf. The sound led him downhill, toward the creek that ran faintly beneath a sheet of ice. His breath came hard, each exhale forming clouds that vanished into the cold. The crying grew louder, drawing him past a stand of dead aspens and down to the frozen bank. There, behind a fallen pine, half buried under drifted snow, he saw it, a small bundle wrapped in gray cloth. He stopped. The world went still. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe. He just stared. The blanket's edges were frozen stiff, rimmed with frost. A corner shifted, and from beneath it, a tiny hand reached out, trembling. "Oh, dear God," Elias muttered, rushing forward. He fell to his knees, brushed away the snow, and gently pulled back the blanket. Inside was a baby, face pale, lips tinged blue, eyes half closed, barely breathing. His chest tightened. "No, no, no," he whispered, hands shaking. He pressed the child to his chest, feeling for warmth. There was almost none. He looked around. No wagon tracks, no footprints, nothing but miles of untouched white. Who would leave a baby out here? The thought barely formed before instinct took over. He ripped off his gloves, tucked the baby inside his coat, pressing it close to his body for heat. His heart hammered as he stood, scanning the horizon one last time. "Hang on, little one," he murmured. "Hang on." He trudged back through the snow, every step a battle. The wind roared like it was trying to steal the child from his arms. Twice he stumbled, once falling to his knees, but he never loosened his hold. By the time he reached the cabin, his hands were numb, his breath ragged. He kicked the door open, rushed to the fire, and laid the baby near the hearth. The little thing whimpered weakly, and that sound, that fragile, flickering sound, tore through him. "Easy now." "Easy," he whispered, his voice breaking. He unwrapped the blanket, rubbed the baby's hands and feet, desperate to spark warmth into its tiny limbs. He'd seen death too many times to mistake it, and he knew this child was close. Too close. "Come on," he murmured, almost praying. "You fight, you hear? You fight." He heated some milk in a tin cup, testing it on his wrist before offering a few drops to the baby's lips. At first, nothing. Then a twitch. A weak swallow. The faintest sign of life. Elias let out a trembling breath he hadn't realized he was holding. All night he stayed beside the fire, feeding the baby small sips, rubbing warmth into its skin, whispering words he hadn't spoken since his own daughter was alive. The cabin, usually filled with the sound of wind and silence, now held something different, the soft, fragile rhythm of breathing. And when morning came and the storm finally broke, Elias Maddox found himself staring at that tiny sleeping face, wondering what kind of cruel world would cast a child into the snow, and why fate had led it to him. He didn't know it yet, but that cry, that single cry in the freezing wilderness, had already changed everything. The first hours after finding the baby were a blur of movement, of instinct and panic. Elias Maddox had never held a child so small, so fragile, that its entire life depended entirely on the strength of someone else. He cradled the baby against his chest, feeling each tiny heartbeat, its warmth almost non-existent against the biting cold. The fire in the hearth was barely enough to take the edge off the winter's chill, and the walls of the cabin groaned as if echoing the helplessness he felt. He moved slowly, deliberately, unwrapping the bundle further, revealing a tiny face pressed against the blanket, the little nose almost blue from the cold. Tears pricked his own eyes, hot and unwanted, burning against the frost that clung to his beard. "Easy now," he whispered softly, over and over, like a mantra he was repeating to keep himself sane. "Easy. You'll be all right." The baby gave a faint whimper and turned its head slightly, blinking open sleepy tiny eyes. It was then that Elias realized how alone it truly was. No mother to comfort it, no sibling to warm it, no one in the world but him. And yet, somehow his own heart, locked tight with grief and isolation for years, opened just enough to let something new in. He brought over a small basin of water, heated by the fire, and gently wiped the frost from the baby's cheeks. Each movement was careful, deliberate, afraid that a single wrong gesture could cause harm. His own hand shook, numbed from the cold, but the warmth he pressed into the infant was more than just physical. It was intention, protection, and the first flicker of hope in what had been a long, endless winter of despair. As he worked, memories clawed at him, memories he had kept buried deep in the corners of his mind. He remembered his wife, Clara, with her hair the color of wheat at sunset, humming a lullaby he could still hear in the deepest recesses of his mind. He remembered the little girl who had clutched his fingers, eyes shining with mischief and trust. He remembered the fever, the nights spent praying to a God who didn't answer, and the empty crib that haunted every room of the cabin. He had thought that grief would harden him, that loneliness would become a fortress. And yet here he was, holding a life so small and fragile that it reminded him of everything he had lost, and everything he could still protect. The hours passed slowly. Snow fell in thick sheets outside, muffling every sound, making the world a silent white expanse. Elias wrapped the baby in layers of blankets, fed it small spoonfuls of warm milk, and rocked it gently in his arms. He hummed a quiet tune, one he remembered from his daughter long ago, and was surprised to hear the baby respond with the tiniest coos. That small sound, so fragile, so delicate, cut through the weight of his loneliness like sunlight through storm clouds. By midday, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. He had been awake for hours, and yet he could not bring himself to rest. The baby needed him. Its life depended on the rhythm of his actions, on the steadiness of his hands. And so he sat by the fire, cradling the child, whispering stories and promises to a life he had yet to understand. He spoke of the mountain, of the deer and the wolves, and the silent rivers that ran beneath the ice. He spoke of warmth and safety and a world that could still hold beauty even when it seemed that everything had been lost. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the baby's breathing grew steadier, the trembling less pronounced. Life had returned, tenuous as a candle flame against the wind, but present and unyielding. As the sun sank low behind the snow-laden peaks, Elias leaned back against the rough wooden wall of the cabin, the baby resting peacefully in his arms. He could feel a tiredness deeper than any he had ever known, bone deep, soul deep, but it was not despair. It was purpose. It was a reason to face the mountain, to face the long winters, to rise with the sun again tomorrow. He looked around the cabin, at the rough table, the fire, the worn bedroll, and thought of how different it was now. Where once there had been emptiness and silence, now there was the soft sound of breathing, the gentle weight of life in his arms. And he knew, in the quiet of the cabin, as the snowstorm raged outside, that he had been given a second chance, not just to save a child, but to save himself from the suffocating grip of grief and solitude. Hours became night. The snowstorm outside intensified, whipping against the cabin walls, rattling the windows and blanketing the world in a pure, harsh silence. But inside there was warmth, there was life, and for the first time in years, there was hope. Elias watched the baby sleep, marveling at how something so small could hold so much weight in his heart. Sleep came slowly to him, in small bursts, always one eye open, one hand resting lightly on the baby's chest. And in those quiet moments, as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, he whispered to the child, though he knew it could not yet understand. "You're safe now," he said. "Safe with me?" For the first time in a long time, he believed it himself. The morning after the storm broke, the mountain seemed almost peaceful, a quiet silver light glinting off the snow like scattered glass. Elias Maddox had been awake long before the sun fully climbed, tending to the baby with a meticulous care born of desperation and newfound hope. Every movement, every breath, every gentle touch was calculated to keep life itself from slipping through his fingers. And yet, just as the day stretched, as the pale winter sun began to seep into the cabin through frost-lined windows, a sound reached him. A knock, hesitant, uncertain. He froze mid-motion, his heart skipping a beat. The wind had brought no knocks, no voices, nothing for months. He gripped the rifle resting against the wall instinctively, every muscle tense, eyes scanning the horizon through the frost-crusted window. Another knock, sharper this time. "Who's there?" His voice was low, wary, carrying the weight of someone who had not spoken to another soul in weeks. "Please, please, sir," came a voice, trembling and soft, almost swallowed by the cold air. My baby. Did you find my baby?" Elias stiffened. The voice, fragile and desperate, pierced through the memories and the solitude he had wrapped around himself like armor. He stepped cautiously to the door, rifle still in hand, eyes narrowing against the sunlight's glare reflecting off the snow. When he opened the door, he saw her. A young woman, trembling from head to toe, wrapped in a thin shawl, hair plastered to her face by frost and wind, eyes wide with fear and relief tangled together. Her lips were cracked and her skin reddened by exposure, but even through the misery, there was a fierceness in her gaze, a spark that refused to die. Elias's heart tightened. He had expected the snow to hold no one, to reveal nothing but emptiness. And yet here she was, standing on the threshold of his life, the weight of a desperate journey written across every line of her face. The baby stirred in the cradle, letting out a small, almost fragile coo. The mother's eyes widened, tears streaming down her cheeks, catching the weak sunlight. "Oh, thank God," she whispered. "Thank you, thank you." "You saved her." Elias lowered the rifle slowly, carefully, as though the movement itself was an act of faith. He nodded, gesturing for her to step inside. "Sit," he said softly. "Sit. She's safe." She stumbled into the cabin, every movement a testament to exhaustion, collapse, and relief. When she finally reached the baby, she dropped to her knees, hands trembling as she brushed the child's tiny cheek. Her lips met the blanket, her tears falling onto the tiny body she had fought so hard to protect. Elias watched silently, a strange mix of awe and wariness in his chest. He had not expected anyone to appear, had not expected life to intrude on the harsh order of his solitude, and yet he could not look away. "My name is Clara," she whispered between sobs. "Clara Hensley, please. She is my daughter, my little one." She broke off, shaking, overwhelmed by emotion. Elias stepped closer, kneeling beside her, the baby between them. "She's alive," he said simply. "That's what matters. She's alive." Clara pressed her forehead to the baby's blanket, breathing in a scent of warmth and smoke, mixed with the faint, rough smell of Elias himself, leather, pine, and fire. For a moment, she let herself feel the relief she had denied herself for miles through snow and wind. Elias, watching her, felt a strange ache he had not recognized in years, empathy, longing, a connection to life and to someone else. Her presence reminded him of the days when his own cabin had been filled with laughter, with tiny footsteps and soft singing in the mornings. The weight of that absence, combined with this sudden spark of life, nearly brought him to his knees. Clara looked up at him then, eyes red and wide. You found her. How did you find her?" Elias shrugged, his rough hands brushing the baby's soft cheek. "She cried," he said simply. "I heard her. That's all. I followed the sound." She nodded slowly, tears falling freely now, as if some of the fear, the desperation, the months of running were leaving her in that small cabin with the man who had become her child's unlikely savior. For hours they sat in silence, the fire crackling, the baby nestled safely between them. Clara told him fragments of her story, how she had fled the wagon train, how the winter storm had overtaken her, how she had feared death with every step, and how she had prayed that someone, anyone, would hear her child's cry. Elias listened, never interrupting, letting her words wash over him. Each sentence, each pause, each sob carried a weight he understood all too well. He had known loss, and now, in her eyes, he saw the reflection of someone else's grief. But this time there was hope, there was life, there was possibility. By evening, Elias had prepared a small bed for Clara near the fire. She sat there, exhausted, her body trembling from the cold, yet her eyes bright with the realization that her child was safe, and that maybe, just maybe, she had found someone she could trust. Elias, for his part, did not speak much. Words were heavy with the past, and silence was safer. Instead, he offered small gestures, passing her water, ensuring the baby's blankets were warm, checking the fire. These quiet acts were his way of saying, without words, that he understood, that he cared, that he would protect them both if it were the last thing he did. Night fell slowly, painting the cabin in shadows, the firelight dancing across the rough wooden walls. Clara finally curled into the makeshift bed, exhausted, letting herself surrender to sleep. Elias watched her and the baby, aware that this night marked a turning point. The mountain had given him back a fragment of life he had thought lost forever. And in that fragile, fleeting moment, he felt something he had not felt in years. Responsibility, connection, and the quiet stirrings of hope. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the tracks they had made, hiding their presence in a blanket of white. But inside the cabin, warmth and life had returned. And in the quiet, as the wind moaned and the fire crackled, Elias Maddox knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The mountain was no longer empty. The fire crackled low, casting shadows across the cabin walls, flickering across Elias's rough features and Clara's weary face. Outside, the snowstorm had softened into a light, persistent fall, the flakes drifting lazily in the pale morning light. Inside, the cabin felt smaller, warmer, and yet every corner held the weight of unspoken stories. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, the baby swaddled tightly against her chest, eyes wide and still red from crying and exhaustion. Elias perched on the edge of the wooden bench, silent, letting her collect herself before speaking. After what felt like hours, Clara finally spoke, her voice a hushed tremor against the fire's soft hum. I don't even know where to start," she said, brushing stray strands of hair from her face. It's all so much." She pressed the baby closer as if her tiny heartbeat might anchor her own. "My name is Clara Hensley, like I said, but I wasn't always a mother alone in the snow. I had a husband. He was cruel. I don't even want to remember his name, because speaking it aloud makes him feel alive again, and I don't want him to exist anymore. Not in my mind, not in my life." Elias remained quiet, letting her words settle, letting her unload the weight she had carried alone for miles through snow and fear. The quiet was a companionable thing, allowing the air to carry the fragments of her story like fragile smoke. "I tried to leave him months ago," she continued, voice breaking. "I knew he would never change. I knew he would never care for me or for our child the way he should. So I ran. I fled with our daughter, hoping, praying, that I could find a place where no one knew my name, where no one would track me, where the mountains would hide me and the snow would be enough to bury us from the world." She took a deep breath, shivering despite the fire. And then the storm came. I don't even know how far I walked. I lost my bearings. I thought I would never see my baby alive again. I thought I had failed her before I even began. And then her lips trembled. "Then you found us." Elias shifted, uncomfortable with the sudden intimacy, but not withdrawing. He had seen grief before, had seen desperation, had seen the exact moment when a human heart decided it was either going to break or survive. He let her talk, let the words wash over him, layering the cabin with the weight of a life almost lost. Clara's voice softened, her gaze dropping to the baby. "I never wanted this life to be like this. I never wanted her to know fear or hunger or the cold like this. I only wanted her to be safe, to grow up knowing she was loved, that she mattered, that she was someone worth saving." Her hand trembled as she adjusted the blanket around the child, her fingers brushing gently over the small, fragile fingers. Elias watched, feeling an ache that he had thought long buried. He remembered the way his own daughter had laughed, had clung to his fingers, had trusted him with her tiny life. That trust had been ripped away by sickness, by cold, by a world that didn't care. And yet here he was, holding someone else's trust in his hands, and he knew, with a clarity that shocked him, that he would not fail this time. Clara's story unfolded in fragments, nights spent hiding from her husband's wrath, days of hunger and frostbite, the desperate decision to flee and abandon everything she had ever known. Elias listened, silent but present, his rough hands resting near the fire, near the life that had been entrusted to him. There was something unspoken in the room, a thread connecting the three of them, the weight of loss, the hope of survival, and the fragile spark of human connection that refused to die even in the harshest conditions. Hours passed. Words spilled from Clara like water from a broken dam. She spoke of the little joys she had clung to in secret, the moments when her daughter's laughter had reminded her of a world worth fighting for. She spoke of the moments of terror, the nights when she thought she would collapse, when she would whisper apologies to her child for failing to protect her. Elias offered small gestures of support, passing her water, stoking the fire, adjusting the blankets around the baby, checking that the tiny life in her arms was safe, warm, and fed. Every movement was careful, deliberate, and quiet, as though the cabin itself required silence to bear witness to the survival unfolding within its walls. By evening, a quiet understanding had settled between them. Clara, though exhausted, was no longer a frightened woman on the verge of collapse. She was a mother, aware of the life she had saved and determined to hold on to it. Elias, though still guarded, understood that his role was no longer just that of a solitary man surviving on a mountain. He had become protector, guardian, witness, and in the quiet moments of the cabin he realized that he had become something he hadn't felt in years, necessary to another person. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering footprints and hiding the signs of their presence from the world. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth, the small fire casting golden light over two adults and one fragile child. For the first time in years, Elias Maddox allowed himself to hope that life could begin again. That loss could be mended, not erased, but carried forward with care and attention. That trust once given could be honored and protected. Clara's voice, now soft and steady, spoke words Elias hadn't expected. "I don't know how we'll survive here. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. But I know this, you saved her. You saved my daughter, and I trust you." Elias looked at her, surprised by the honesty, by the simplicity of the statement. No lies, no pretenses, no fear of judgment. Just trust. And for a man who had lived in isolation, who had believed the mountain would be his only companion forever, the weight of that trust was both terrifying and exhilarating. That night, Clara slept with the baby in her arms, her body curled protectively around the tiny life. Elias sat by the fire, staring into the flames, lost in thought. The mountain was quiet, the snow covering everything outside in pristine white. And yet, inside the cabin, a fragile new world had begun, one built not on isolation, but on shared survival, mutual dependence, and the faint stirrings of hope. Elias knew the coming days would be difficult. The mountains were harsh. The cold was relentless. Danger could appear at any moment, human or otherwise. But for now, he allowed himself a rare fleeting satisfaction. They were alive. They had survived the snow. And for the first time he felt that perhaps, just perhaps, the mountain was no longer a prison, but a sanctuary. The night outside the cabin was relentless. Snow fell in endless sheets, piling upon itself, the wind slicing across the mountain ridges with a fury that could freeze a man's blood in his veins. Inside, Elias Maddox sat alone by the fire, the baby asleep in Clara's arms, her breathing slow and steady, a fragile rhythm that promised life and hope. Yet even in this warmth, Elias felt the weight of the past pressing against him, memories long buried clawing their way back into his mind like unwelcome specters. He stared into the flames, the flickering light casting shifting shadows across the cabin walls. Each crackle of firewood seemed to echo with a voice from long ago, laughter, cries, whispers. And in that dance of light and shadow, Elias saw them. Clara, his wife, the woman whose touch had once brought warmth to every corner of his life. Her face appeared in the flames, soft golden hair catching the light like sun through autumn leaves, eyes bright and alive, smiling at him as she had every morning when the world was new. He reached out, almost without thinking, as if his hand could touch the memory, could bridge the distance that death had carved. And then there was his daughter, a little girl with curls like spun gold, who had run through the cabin, giggling, tripping over the rugs, calling his name with a trust that only a child can know. He could hear her tiny voice now, the echo of her laughter bouncing off walls long since empty, filling the cabin with a ghostly chorus that made his chest tighten. The memories were sharp, vivid, and cruel. He remembered the fever that had taken them, the endless nights spent by a sick bed, praying to a God who remained silent, watching as the life he loved was swept away. He remembered the emptiness afterward, the walls echoing with silence, the nights spent staring at the cold ceiling, wondering how he could continue living in a world that had taken everything from him. Years had passed. Long months of isolation had hardened him. He had built his walls with wood and stone, with fire and snow, with silence and solitude. The mountain had been his refuge, but also his prison. He had learned to live alone, to shut out the world, to carry his grief like a weight that could not be shared. Friends had tried to reach him once, long ago, but he had turned them away, fearing that to open his heart would be to invite more loss. And yet here he was, holding a life that depended entirely on him. A child, fragile and helpless, whose cry had pierced the snow and brought him back into the world. A woman, desperate and terrified, whose trust had been placed in his hands without question. The ghosts of the past pressed against him, and for the first time in years he felt the stirrings of something he had thought buried forever: hope. He thought of Clara's journey through the snow, of the terror she must have felt, of the nights spent fleeing a man who would not forgive, of the endless march through cold and darkness. And he knew that the mountain had not just given him a second chance, it had given him a mission: to protect, to nurture, to honor the life that had been entrusted to him. Yet the memories would not leave him. In the quiet of the night, the past crept forward in every sound. The whisper of the wind through the cabin cracks became the echo of his wife calling for help. The crackle of the fire became the fevered murmurings of a dying child. He saw himself as he had been then, helpless, frantic, consumed by grief, and felt the familiar sting of guilt. "I should have," he muttered, voice barely audible over the fire. "I should have done more. I should have—" But the words trailed off into silence. The past could not be changed. The lost could not be returned. All he had now was this moment: the child sleeping in the safety of his cabin, the woman who had survived against all odds, the fire that kept the cold at bay. He rose from the bench and walked slowly to the small window, looking out at the endless expanse of white, the mountain rising like a silent sentinel against the gray sky. Memories pressed against him still, but they were tempered now with resolve. He had survived the loss before. He would survive the future. He would not fail this time. Not her, not the child, not the woman who had placed her trust in his hands. The firelight flickered, and in its glow, Elias felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years: the possibility of forgiveness for the past, for himself, for the failures that had haunted him. The mountain had taught him solitude, but the child had taught him hope, and Clara had taught him trust. And in that combination, harsh and fragile as it was, Elias understood that life could begin again, even in the shadow of ghosts. He sat back down, returning to his vigil by the fire. The baby stirred slightly in Clara's arms, a tiny hand reaching up toward him as if sensing the protection he offered. He touched it lightly, feeling warmth and life, and the fragile thread that connected him to the present. The night stretched on, long and silent, broken only by the soft breathing of the child and the occasional whisper of Clara murmuring to herself, to the baby, to the fire. Elias listened, feeling the weight of the past and the promise of the future intertwined, knowing that the mountain, once a place of isolation, was becoming a place of rebirth. And as the first light of dawn began to pierce the gray sky, dusting the snow with pale gold, Elias Maddox allowed himself a rare, trembling smile. The ghosts of the past would always linger, but they no longer held dominion over him. He had life to protect. He had trust to honor. And he had the fragile, unspoken promise of a future that might, just might, bring healing to a heart long broken. The mountain was no longer silent. It held life, it held hope, and in its shadows, Elias Maddox began to learn how to forgive himself. The first morning after Clara had shared her story dawned quietly over the mountains. Pale sunlight filtered through frost-laced windows, dusting the cabin in a muted gold. Snow had settled outside in soft, unbroken layers, and the world beyond the cabin seemed impossibly still, as if waiting for life to bloom once more inside. The rough wooden walls. Elias Maddox stirred slowly, hands aching from the long hours beside the fire, heart heavy but tempered with purpose. For the first time in years he was not alone. The cabin, once a sanctuary of grief and silence, now vibrated with life, the soft coos of the baby, the whisper of Clara arranging blankets, the quiet groan of the old wood as it settled in the cold. Clara stirred as well, blinking against the sunlight, her hair a tangle of frost and sleep. She pressed her lips gently to the baby's forehead before rising, her movements deliberate but tender, almost ritualistic. Every touch, every glance was imbued with a mother's instinct, the fierce love of someone who had survived against impossible odds to protect the fragile life in her arms. Elias watched, a subtle ache tightening his chest. He had lived decades in solitude, believing that the mountain, with its vast, indifferent silence, was all he needed. Yet here in this cabin, warmth did not come from the fire alone. It came from the life beside him, the trust that had been placed in his hands, and the small, unspoken bond forming between them. "Sleep well?" he asked, voice rough from disuse. Clara nodded, smiling faintly, though exhaustion lingered in the curve of her shoulders. "Better than I have in months," she replied, her voice soft, almost melodic, a fragile thread of comfort in the crisp air. "She sleeps well, too. Thanks to you." Elias inclined his head. "We both need her alive," he said simply. "That's enough reason to keep moving." The baby stirred at that moment, tiny fingers curling around Clara's thumb. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the child's lips, and Clara's eyes softened, relief flooding her features. "She's amazing," Clara whispered. "Even after everything, she's amazing." Elias felt a flicker of emotion he had not allowed himself to acknowledge in years. Pride, not for himself, not for some accomplishment, but for life persevering against the relentless odds of the world. The baby was a living testament to survival, a reminder that even in the coldest, harshest winters, warmth could be found. The morning unfolded with slow, deliberate rhythm. Elias stoked the fire, prepared a small breakfast of oats and tea, and ensured the cabin was safe from the elements. Clara tended to the baby, humming a soft tune that echoed faintly in the wood-lined walls. Together they established a routine, a fragile new pattern of life that required trust, cooperation, and an openness neither had experienced in years. As the hours passed, Clara ventured outside for the first time since arriving. She stepped carefully through the snow, each footfall deliberate, wary of hidden ice and frostbite. Elias followed, his presence a steady, silent assurance. Together they checked traps Elias had set for small game, ensuring their survival through the harsh mountain winter. Clara's hands, though delicate, proved nimble, quickly learning the methods Elias had honed over years of solitary living. The mountain, once a cold and unyielding adversary, began to show its subtler gifts: hidden streams with clear, drinkable water, clusters of berry bushes barely peeking above the snow, tracks of deer and rabbits marking the landscape with opportunities for sustenance. Elias watched Clara adapt, her curiosity and determination shining through the frost, and felt a subtle shift within himself. The mountain no longer demanded only survival. It invited renewal. In the evenings, they returned to the cabin, the baby nestled between them as they shared stories of past lives, carefully threading humor and memory with the present's cautious hope. Clara spoke of fleeting joys, of small triumphs in her past life, while Elias recounted moments of survival, of loss, and the stark reality of the mountain's unforgiving nature. Through these exchanges, an unspoken understanding began to grow. They were not merely sharing shelter, but rebuilding the fragments of a life long shattered. Days bled into weeks, each one marked by incremental victories. Elias taught Clara to track game through the snow, to recognize the subtle signs of approaching storms, to read the language of the mountain as one would a sacred text. Clara, in turn, brought warmth into the cabin that Elias had not realized he had missed. Laughter at small accidents, gentle teasing, and the comforting rhythm of shared meals prepared together. The baby flourished under their combined care, growing stronger and more expressive with each passing day. Her tiny hands grasped with increasing confidence, her coos turned into tentative babbles, and her eyes shone with the recognition of safety, love, and care. In turn, Elias and Clara found themselves tethered not just to the child, but to each other. A fragile, evolving bond built on trust, survival, and a shared understanding of loss and hope. One night, as a storm raged outside, blowing snow against the cabin walls with the force of a living thing, Elias and Clara sat by the fire, the baby asleep between them. The wind rattled the old wood, yet inside, warmth and life prevailed. Elias felt a rare vulnerability, a crack in the armor he had built over decades. He turned to Clara, voice low but steady. "You've changed this place," he said. "Changed me. I didn't know. I didn't know it was possible to feel alive again." Clara looked at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight, warm and penetrating. "We've both been given a second chance," she said softly. "And this time we won't waste it. We have her, and we have each other." "That's more than enough." The words hung in the cabin, heavy with meaning, yet light with possibility. The mountain outside continued its relentless assault. But within the rough walls, life had found its rhythm, trust had begun to weave its threads, and the seeds of hope had taken root. For Elias Maddox, the mountain was no longer a place of solitude or grief. It had become a crucible of renewal, a stage upon which life could be rebuilt, and a testament to the resilience of the human heart. With Clara and the child by his side, he understood finally that survival was not merely about enduring, it was about learning to live again. And as he watched the fire flicker against the wooden walls, hearing the soft coos of the baby and the gentle hum of Clara's voice, Elias felt for the first time in years that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Weeks had passed since Clara and her baby had arrived at Elias Maddox's cabin. Snow had thickened into drifts that swallowed the tracks of their survival, hiding evidence of their presence from the mountain's usual predators, and, until now, from human eyes as well. Inside, a fragile rhythm of life had taken root. Elias had taught Clara to trap small game and read the mountain's subtle signs, while she brought warmth, laughter, and careful attention to the cabin's small comforts. The baby thrived, cooing and gurgling as she grew stronger each day. But the mountain, which had shown them both mercy and reprieve, had not forgotten the cruelty of the world beyond its peaks. One gray morning, when the sky was heavy with the promise of snow, Elias noticed signs that made his heart tighten. Faint tracks, too deliberate to be wildlife, fresh footprints pressing through the thin layer of powder near the cabin's edge. He followed them cautiously, rifle in hand, scanning the horizon. The prints led toward the tree line, as if someone had approached the cabin recently and then retreated into the dense forest. When he returned, Clara was kneeling beside the baby, brushing a curl from her forehead. "Elias, something's out there," he said quietly, avoiding panic but letting tension underline his tone. Clara's hands froze in mid-motion, and the baby stirred slightly. Her eyes widened, understanding dawning. "A person?" Elias nodded. "Tracks. Fresh. Deliberate. Someone's been watching." The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt vulnerable. The mountain's quiet had always been deceptive, a shield as much as a prison. But human threats were different. Human intent carried malice, and he knew it all too well. Throughout the day, Elias and Clara prepared cautiously. They fortified windows, stacked firewood for defense, and devised a rotation. One would stay with the baby, while the other patrolled the perimeter. Clara, despite her delicate frame and the months of terror she had endured, moved with determination. Her eyes were sharp, reflecting both fear and a resolve Elias had come to admire. As twilight approached, a shadow appeared near the tree line. Elias spotted it first, crouched low behind a stand of pines. The figure moved deliberately, scanning, calculating. He raised his rifle, whispering to Clara, "Stay inside. Don't move. I'll handle this." Clara obeyed, clutching the baby close, feeling a mixture of fear and confidence that Elias would protect them. She listened as the crunch of snow grew louder, the air thick with anticipation. The man emerged fully from the forest, tall, rugged, but unmistakably human. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked on the cabin. Elias recognized the bearing immediately, a man used to dominance, accustomed to intimidation. He was not just a stranger. He was a threat, carrying the weight of purpose behind his gaze. Clara's breath caught in her throat. He's here for me, isn't he?" Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he observed, noting the tension in the stranger's posture, the calculated movements that spoke of experience, not random mischief. "Maybe," he said at last. "But we'll see. Stay calm. Don't make a sound." The man stepped closer, hands slightly raised as if testing the boundaries. "Clara Hensley!" he called, voice carrying over the wind, low and menacing. "You've run far enough. Come with me." Clara's grip on the baby tightened. "No," she said, voice trembling but firm. "I will not go with you." Elias emerged from the cabin doorway, rifle leveled, eyes locked on the intruder. "You're not taking her," he said, his voice low, steady, full of a quiet authority that carried more weight than any weapon. The stranger's lips curled in a half-smile, recognizing a challenge he hadn't expected. "You don't know what you're stepping into, mountain man," he warned. "She belongs to me. I've claimed her, and you're in my way." Elias's jaw tightened. Years of survival, of loss, of navigating the harshest elements the mountain could offer had honed him into a man who understood danger and how to confront it. "She belongs to no one," Elias said firmly. "Not you. Not anyone. I'm warning you. Leave now, or you'll regret it." The stranger laughed, a sound as cruel as the wind slicing through the trees. "We'll see about that," he replied, taking a step forward, assessing Elias with a predator's precision. Clara moved instinctively, stepping in front of the baby, her eyes darting between Elias and the intruder. Fear surged, but determination overrode it. She would not allow this man to take her child. She had survived so much, and she would survive this too. A tense standoff unfolded, the wind whistling through the treetops, the mountain holding its breath along with them. Each man measured the other, calculating, waiting, testing resolve. Elias's grip on the rifle was steady. Clara's presence reminded him why he fought, why he survived, and why he would not yield. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity. Then, a misstep. The stranger's boot slipped on the icy snow, giving Elias the opening he had been waiting for. With precise movement, honed by years of solitude and survival, he lunged, forcing the intruder backward, away from the cabin. "You leave now," Elias said, voice low and deadly. "You try this again and it won't end in words." The man hesitated, evaluating, calculating his odds. Then, with a final glare, he retreated into the shadows of the forest, disappearing as suddenly as he had appeared. Clara exhaled, relief flooding her features. She knelt beside the baby, cradling the child close. "Thank you," she whispered to Elias, tears of relief and fear mingling. Elias lowered the rifle slowly, finally allowing himself to feel the weight of what had just transpired. "This mountain protects us," he said quietly, "but we can't let our guard down, not for a second." As the storm returned, swirling snow against the cabin walls, Elias and Clara sat together, watching the flames dance. The baby slept soundly, unaware of the danger that had passed. Outside, the mountain raged, but inside, trust had been tested and strengthened. And in that quiet, tenuous moment, Elias realized something profound. Survival was not just about enduring the elements, but about protecting those you loved from the storms of the world, both natural and human. For the first time since Clara and her daughter had arrived, he understood fully that life, with all its fragile beauty, was worth fighting for, and he would fight with everything he had. The storm had passed, leaving the mountain crisp and white, its harsh beauty softened by the pale sunlight reflecting off endless drifts of snow. Inside the cabin, life was beginning to settle into a fragile rhythm, one of shared responsibility, tentative trust, and the quiet, unspoken stirrings of something neither Elias nor Clara had expected. Elias rose early, as always, the habit of solitude and survival ingrained deep into his bones. But this morning he did not leave the cabin immediately. He lingered near the fire, watching Clara, who was gently waking the baby, brushing a stray curl from her forehead and humming softly. The melody was tender, fragile, and carried warmth that filled the cabin in ways fire alone never could. For a long moment, he simply watched, the weight of his past and the hardships of the mountain fading against the simplicity of this scene. Two lives intertwined with his now, fragile but alive. Clara noticed his gaze and offered a small, knowing smile, one that spoke of gratitude, acknowledgement, and something deeper that neither dared voice. "Good morning," she said softly, her eyes lingering on him with an intensity that made him feel seen in a way he had not been for years. Elias nodded, a subtle smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Morning. She slept well?" Clara nodded, cradling the baby close. "Better than I have in months. I think she feels safe here." "And so should you," Elias replied, his tone low but firm, carrying the weight of promise. As the day unfolded, they worked together seamlessly, preparing a modest breakfast and tending to the cabin. The act of living, once solitary and mechanical for Elias, had become a shared ritual. Clara learned quickly, her movements gaining confidence, her laughter filling the quiet spaces of the cabin. Each shared task, from chopping wood to preparing meals, wove an invisible thread between them, a delicate tapestry of trust and reliance. During a lull, as the baby slept beside them in a makeshift cradle, Clara ventured closer to Elias, her eyes meeting his with curiosity, and something softer, almost tentative. "Elias, why do you do it?" she asked, voice low and sincere. "Why do you survive up here all alone?" He paused, the question hanging in the air. He had asked himself the same thing countless times during long nights, staring at the cold mountain ceiling. "Because I had to," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "Because it was the only way to keep going after losing everything. And because I knew one day someone might need me." Clara's gaze softened. "And now?" "Now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know someone does." The words, simple yet heavy with meaning, hung between them. Clara felt a warmth rise in her chest, an acknowledgement of shared burdens and emerging trust. She shifted closer, instinctively reaching for his hand, and Elias, after a brief hesitation, allowed hers to brush against his. The contact was small, tentative, but it sparked something neither could ignore, the possibility of connection, the fragile beginnings of affection. Over the following days, their bond strengthened. Elias taught Clara how to read the subtle signs of the mountain, the tracks that marked game, the whispers of the wind that signaled approaching storms, and the language of the trees, snow, and sky that only someone who lived closely with nature could understand. Clara, in turn, brought warmth, comfort, and human connection into Elias's life, coaxing laughter from him in moments he had long thought impossible. The baby became a bridge between them, a living reminder of hope, responsibility, and the fragility of life. Watching Clara nurture her child, Elias felt something he had thought long dead, the stirrings of protective affection and silent admiration. He realized that this bond, growing slowly and quietly amid the harsh mountain landscape, was changing him in ways he could not yet fully understand. One evening, after the baby had fallen asleep, Clara approached Elias as he tended the fire. The room was bathed in a warm golden glow, and the wind outside whispered against the cabin walls. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Elias, thank you," she said, "for saving us, for letting me stay, for everything." He looked up from the fire, his eyes meeting hers. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "I didn't save you to hear thanks. I saved you because it was the right thing to do. Because you matter to me." The words struck Clara deeply. For the first time, she felt truly seen and protected. The vulnerability in his eyes mirrored her own. A mutual understanding that was fragile, profound, and quietly shifting the dynamic between them. Days turned into weeks, and their routine became a dance of shared life. Chores, laughter, meals, and quiet moments of intimacy. Fleeting but deeply felt. Each glance, each small touch built trust. Each shared smile became a silent promise of companionship, slowly eroding the walls Elias had built around his heart. One night, as snow swirled outside like a curtain of stars, Clara dared a small, daring step. She rested her head against Elias's shoulder as he sat beside her, the baby nestled safely between them. The warmth of his arm around her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the quiet of the cabin created a cocoon of safety and intimacy. Elias stiffened at first, unaccustomed to this closeness, but slowly, carefully, he wrapped his arm around her, allowing the tentative contact to linger. The weight of the past, the mountain's harshness, and the storms they had faced seemed to melt away in that small, quiet moment. "You feel different," Clara whispered, her voice muffled against his coat. "Not just safer, but like home." Elias's lips pressed together in a rare, soft smile. "Home," he repeated. "I haven't felt that word in a long time." Outside, the mountain loomed, silent and eternal. Inside, a fragile new life had taken root, one of trust, survival, and quiet affection. Elias, Clara, and the baby formed an unspoken family, bound by shared adversity and the slow, steady growth of connection. In the harsh wilderness, amidst snow, storms, and isolation, Elias Maddox had discovered something he thought lost forever: the possibility of love, the warmth of trust, and the quiet strength that comes from letting someone in. And as the fire flickered against the cabin walls, he understood that this closeness, tender, fragile, and real, was worth every risk, every hardship, and every challenge the mountain could throw their way. For the first time, he allowed himself to hope that life could be more than survival. It could be living it together. The days grew colder as winter pressed further into the mountains, a relentless white tide that blanketed the world in frost and silence. Inside the cabin, life continued its fragile rhythm. Elias Maddox, Clara, and the baby had formed an uneasy but comforting routine. Each day began with the careful tending of fire and supplies, the preparation of simple meals, and the delicate navigation of snow-laden paths for food and water. Nights were quiet, filled with the soft breaths of the child and the comforting hum of a hearth that had grown more than just a source of warmth. Yet the mountain, in its cruel impartiality, does not forgive the living for forgetting caution. It began subtly, footsteps crunching faintly in snow too heavy to have been made by the wind. A shadow flitting just beyond the tree line, vanishing when observed directly. A sudden rustle in the woods that made both Elias and Clara freeze mid-motion. At first, Elias dismissed it as the usual wildlife, mountain hares, foxes, or the scuttling of small creatures seeking warmth. But the unease in his gut was insistent. Human threats are unlike the wild. They plan, observe, and lie in wait. One late afternoon, Elias returned from checking traps, the heavy rifle slung across his back. Snow crunched underfoot, echoing through the silent trees, and he noted with a furrowed brow the subtle irregularities. Footprints partially covered, disturbed branches, a snowbank that looked freshly hollowed. He slowed his pace, senses sharpening, every movement deliberate. The mountain had taught him patience. Now it demanded vigilance. Back at the cabin, Clara was tending to the fire. She glanced up as Elias approached, sensing the tension radiating from him. "Something's wrong," she said quietly, voice taut with instinctive caution. Elias did not answer immediately. He set down the rifle and scanned the horizon. "Someone's out there," he said finally. "Watching, waiting. I can feel it. And they're not like the man from before. They're different, careful, calculating." Clara swallowed hard, holding the baby closer. Fear surged, mingled with the growing trust and love she felt for Elias. "What do we do?" she asked. He knelt beside her, voice low but firm. "We prepare. We stay alert. This cabin is our sanctuary, but we can't rely on the mountain alone. We rely on each other." Night fell like a curtain, blanketing the world in darkness. Elias and Clara moved with quiet efficiency, barricading the cabin doors and windows, ensuring every crack and crevice was covered. The baby, oblivious to the mounting tension, slept peacefully, unaware that the very air around her held the stirrings of danger. Hours later, as a thin moon cast silver shadows over the snow, a figure appeared at the edge of the tree line. Elias noticed first, the silhouette of a man, tall, lean, and deliberate in his approach, a dark coat blending with the night. He moved without sound, an expert in the art of stalking, eyes scanning the cabin as though memorizing every detail. Clara's breath caught. Who is that?" she whispered. Elias's hands tightened on his rifle. "I don't know yet. But he's not here to trade pleasantries." The man stepped closer, and the snow betrayed him, crunching faintly underfoot. Clara instinctively moved in front of the baby, her voice steady despite the fear. "Stay back!" The stranger paused, lifting his hands slightly, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Ah, the mountain man? I've heard of you," he said, voice calm but edged with menace. "Clever, strong, and stubborn. And the girl, well, she's far from where she belongs, isn't she?" Elias's jaw tightened. "She's exactly where she belongs. And if you take another step, you'll regret it." The man chuckled softly, the sound cutting through the stillness like a blade. Brave words for someone who lives in a cage of snow and wood. "I came for her, and nothing will stop me." Elias shifted subtly, positioning himself between the intruder and the cabin, every muscle coiled like a spring. He studied the man, noting his stance, the way he measured distance, the subtle tension in his arms. Years of isolation and survival had honed him into a predator in his own right, a man who could outthink, outmaneuver, and endure almost anything the mountain or man could throw at him. "Leave," Elias said, voice low but unyielding. "Now, you don't know what you're facing." The intruder's smirk widened. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm facing. A man who thinks he's a guardian. But there's only so long one can hide in the mountains before reality finds you." With a sudden, precise movement, the man lunged toward the cabin, forcing Elias into action. The two clashed in a flurry of movement, snow scattering, fists and elbows striking, every motion tense, fast, and deliberate. Elias used his knowledge of the terrain to his advantage, sliding across icy patches, ducking behind trees, and using leverage to counter his opponent's attacks. The intruder was skilled, yes, but Elias's determination, fueled by the need to protect Clara and the child, gave him an edge he had not felt in years. Clara, realizing the fight was escalating, moved carefully to gather the baby, securing her against her chest. Her eyes were sharp, alert, scanning for any opportunity to assist without putting their daughter in danger. She realized then, with a mixture of fear and resolve, that they were no longer just surviving. They were defending everything they held dear. After tense moments that seemed to stretch into eternity, Elias gained the upper hand. With a decisive move, he forced the intruder to stumble into the snowbank, chest heaving and eyes wide with surprise. Elias leveled his rifle, voice calm but lethal. "This is your warning. Leave, or you won't leave at all. The man glared, calculating. But the fire in Elias's eyes, the unyielding will of a man who had survived decades alone, who had faced death countless times, and who now had something worth fighting for, made his choice clear. With a final venomous glare, the intruder retreated into the shadows, disappearing into the mountain's night. Clara exhaled, relief flooding her features. The baby stirred but did not cry, sensing the return of safety. She pressed closer to Elias, voice trembling. He's gone? For now, Elias replied, still tense, eyes scanning the tree line. But this isn't over. The mountain protects us, but not forever. We must stay vigilant. Always. In the aftermath, as the wind howled and snow drifted against the cabin walls, Elias and Clara sat together, the baby nestled between them. Trust had been tested, courage measured, and the fragile bonds of their small family had been strengthened under fire. Elias felt something deep within, a recognition that the mountain's trials were not just tests of survival. They were shaping him, Clara, and the baby into something stronger. The intrusion had been frightening, yes, but it had also revealed their capacity to fight, to protect, and to survive together. And in that quiet, snowbound night, Elias Maddox understood something profound. The mountain could challenge them. Human threats could loom in the shadows, but together, he, Clara, and the child, they could endure anything. For survival was no longer enough. Now they would thrive. The first pale light of dawn crept across the mountain peaks, painting the snow in muted shades of silver and gold. After nights of relentless wind and piercing cold, the world seemed suspended in a fragile stillness, a brief reprieve from the harshness of the wilderness. Inside the cabin, warmth radiated from the fire, mingling with the gentle hum of life, Clara humming softly, the baby stirring in her crib, and Elias tending to the hearth with quiet, focused care. Weeks had passed since the last confrontation. The shadowy intruder had vanished into the mountains, leaving only a lingering threat that the world outside could still encroach. Yet inside the cabin, a new reality had taken root, one of trust, affection, and the fragile beginnings of family. Elias watched Clara as she moved about the room, her hands deftly preparing a modest breakfast, her eyes occasionally meeting his with a quiet intensity. It was a look that conveyed gratitude, recognition, and something more, something that had been slowly growing, imperceptibly at first, then undeniable. Clara paused, glancing toward the baby who was now awake, cooing softly. She knelt to cradle her child, her voice gentle. Look at her, Elias. She's growing strong every day. You've given her life, safety, a chance she wouldn't have had alone. Elias stepped closer, his presence grounding and steady. We've all changed, he said softly, voice carrying both authority and warmth. The mountain has taught us survival, but you've taught me something I thought I'd lost. Clara's eyes lifted to meet his, searching for meaning in his words. And what's that? Elias's gaze softened, revealing the vulnerability he rarely allowed to show. Hope, belief that life can be more than just enduring, that love can exist, even in the coldest, harshest places. A gentle silence settled between them, punctuated only by the soft gurgle of the baby and the crackling of the fire. In that silence, Clara understood that Elias's walls, the impenetrable armor of solitude and survival, had begun to crumble, replaced by the warmth of connection, trust, and the possibility of happiness. The morning unfolded in simple rituals, preparing food, tidying the cabin, and stepping outside briefly to check the traps. The mountain, vast and indifferent, remained a formidable presence, but inside the cabin, life had begun to flourish. Elias and Clara moved with an unspoken synchronicity, each action echoing their growing bond, each glance reinforcing the silent acknowledgement that they were no longer alone. As midday approached, Elias paused near the door, glancing toward the tree line. The world outside was silent, pristine and beautiful, yet he knew that danger could return at any moment. But today, he allowed himself a rare moment of contemplation, considering not just survival, but the life they could build together. Clara approached, carrying the baby wrapped in a blanket. She leaned against him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. "Elias, do you ever imagine what it will be like when the snow melts? When the world opens up again?" Elias considered this, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I do," he admitted. "I imagine a life where we're not just surviving, but living, where the baby can grow without fear and we can find happiness together." The words hung in the air, fragile and heavy with promise. Clara's heart swelled with a mix of relief, gratitude, and something deeper, a dawning realization that the man who had been her protector, her guardian, and her constant strength was becoming something more. Hours passed in quiet domesticity, the baby sleeping peacefully between them. The snow outside reflected the sun, casting a luminous glow across the cabin walls. Elias and Clara sat together, sharing warmth, watching the day unfold, and speaking in soft, deliberate tones about plans, hopes, and the small, enduring joys of life. As the sun began its descent, casting long golden shadows across the mountain, Clara spoke, voice steady and resolute. "Elias, I know the world outside these mountains is harsh, but in here with you, I feel safe. I feel loved, and I want to stay with you, with her, always." Elias's hand brushed against hers, a simple gesture filled with unspoken commitment. "And you will," he said softly. "This cabin, this mountain. It may be harsh, unforgiving, but here with you and her, I've found home. Not just a place, but family, love, and a future." The baby stirred, reaching out with tiny hands, and Elias and Clara both leaned down, letting her small, trusting fingers wrap around theirs. In that moment, the three of them were bound by more than survival. They were bound by trust, care, and a shared promise of life. Night fell once more, blanketing the mountain in darkness. But inside the cabin, the fire burned steadily, casting shadows that danced along the walls. Clara and Elias sat close, the baby nestled between them, each heartbeat synchronized in the rhythm of life they had chosen to share. Elias spoke again, voice low and tender, carrying the weight of everything they had endured. "We've faced storms, threats, and the coldest nights, but none of that compares to what we've built here, together. I've spent decades alone, but now I'm never alone again." Clara rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "Neither am I," she whispered, "and neither is she. We have each other, and that's more than enough." Outside, the mountain raged quietly, a reminder of the world's indifferent trials. But inside, love, trust, and family thrived. And as Elias, Clara, and the baby sat together, watching the last light of day fade behind the peaks, they knew this was the dawn of something enduring, a life forged in adversity, strengthened by courage and bound by the unbreakable ties of heart and home. In the cold expanse of the mountains, they had discovered warmth. In the harsh wilderness, they had discovered trust. And in each other, they had discovered the most profound truth of all, that even in the most unforgiving places, love could survive and flourish. The winter's dawn had arrived, and with it a new beginning.